Hello dear crypto friends, and welcome to today's video in which obviously we are going to take a look at the crypto market, at Bitcoin, and try to understand what is going on, why is it still falling, how low can it go, what could be the worst case scenario. As always, I have opened the weekly chart with our good long-term logarithmic price channel. It's the pessimistic one, by the way. I have switched from the optimistic one to the pessimistic one because it's somehow not looking so good right now. And as we can see, this sucker already continues dropping, destroying the fractal similarity that we had to the previous lows. Best case, we can hope for something like this here for a low akin to May to July 2021. That is probably now the best we can hope for. But I'm not so sure if such a scenario would happen, because honestly I'm slowly starting to think that if there doesn't happen a miracle soon, and if the Fed doesn't pivot already in July, because in the last video I said I think there is a quite high likelihood that the Fed will pivot at some point later this year, but we don't know when, right? Will it be for the meeting in September or will it be for the meeting in July? We don't know when they will pivot, even the market starts to be more undecided. Only 80% now think that we will get a 75 basis point hike, with 19.2 thinking it might be only 50 basis points. So it's unclear when the Fed will turn their stance and become more dovish. So when they will stop raising the interest rate so aggressively. That event is called pivoting. So we don't know exactly when that will happen, and in the worst case scenario where the Fed will pivot as late as September, that would mean, friends, we could still be going down for a few more months. And that in turn would mean, I think it's pretty likely that we would honestly revisit this support area given here by those two tops from July 2019 and August 2020. I'm starting to think that we could really revisit this area, and we could really go down as low as about 12,500. 12,500 and I don't know, maybe a second drop. And we could stay down the whole year, and only when the Fed will pivot and the stock market would then reverse and we would go up again, then the Bitcoin would also follow. Because right now Bitcoin is really just one-to-one following the stock market. So if the stock market will fall now, if the Fed will pivot in September, that means July, August, 2 more months of continuous brutal downside, bam, down to 12,000. And then here in September, we might start to get a recovery. And even then, I'm not sure if we will go directly into a rally or if this will be just a bounce and only later we start continuing going up. But right now, the dollar index is of course pumping because Jerome Powell, the almighty, said, I'm super hawkish, I will continue hiking even if the market crashes to zero. I don't give a f***. I will just continue hiking until everything is going to zero. That is also a good solution to solve the inflation problem by making everyone poor. That is a good solution, because if you make everyone poor, no one has money anymore to buy anything. Inflation solved. Genius, genius. So the dollar index just keeps on pumping. We see that in the daily chart, it just appears to make a new push to the upside. So maybe it makes a new high. But I have to say there's still this weakness remaining, there's still this bearish divergence, so it will be interesting to see how this plays out. Sooner or later the dollar index will dump, but of course if the Fed decides to pivot as late as in the meeting in, when was it, late September, 21st of September, we are looking at probably a few more months of relentless pumping. Because here, 21st of September is still quite far away. So it could still happen that we go to 110, 111 in the dollar index until then. And of course, all the while making a bearish divergence, but still, I mean, it could still rise. And then only as late as that time, the dollar index will finally implode. And that is also the time when the stock market will then finally pump. But until then, if we go to the S&P 500, this is not looking good right now. I mean, this is just relentlessly falling. This is just going down like a sucker. And If the Fed surprises us and pivots in July, as I said, earlier than most people expect, I'm pretty sure that we will get an unexpected pump, right? Because the market is not pricing that in right now. As we saw, the market is pricing in a 50 basis point hike and a 75 one, and there's not even the talk about pivoting in July. There's not even a chance, the market doesn't even see the chance that the Fed would pivot in July. So this would be a brutal rally. But as I know the Fed right now, I'm starting to think that they will not pivot and they will just relentlessly hike, and the market will just brutally dump until September, when they finally might start to pivot. So that means that we will just really go down until September. How low, nobody can tell, but it really might be a brutal correction. We might really have a almost 50% correction from the all-time high, and only then, when the Fed announces, okay, now it's better that we start reversing our stance because everything seems to be dropping to zero. And the CPI, I think sooner or later inflation will come down. There's already talk that peak inflation has happened, so there's a lot of inventory build up, and it looks as if inflation will start to slowly come down. So at some point the stock market will reverse, probably when the Fed will announce that they are going to turn direction, at the latest in late September, in my opinion. But until then, things could get really ugly, especially if we look at the VIX, the volatility of the S&P 500. This is not a good looking sign, because the VIX is doing something which it did many times before. It's rising in such a channel here. It's making like a triangle structure. And every time it did this stuff, every time, look at this, every time it was followed by a spike. Every time, look here, every time it had such a resistance line, bam, brutal spike. Here, long resistance line, really a long falling wedge trend channel, bam, brutal spike. Every single time. You can really look at all the times. This is insane. I mean, this is hilarious. Every time followed by a brutal spike, all the time. So it is unfortunately quite likely that at some point we will get a brutal spike. How high will it go? I don't know. But a brutal spike in the VIX means a high volatility, and that in turn means brutal dumps. Spikes always coincide with brutal dumps because they are the fastest. It's like bam, brutal insta dump means the volatility is very high. So a spike in the VIX will of course mean complete crash in the stock market. We are potentially looking at a further downside, insane downside. Maybe even, I don't know if it will be as brutal as 2008, but we could really be looking at a further 20-30% crash to the downside. So that after this whole thing, you know, prices in the S&P 500 might really have corrected by over 30%, 35%, 37%, 40%, something like that. And the Nasdaq, of course, will correct even more. The Nasdaq is much more affected by this stuff. Currently, it is in a falling wedge structure, and the Nasdaq could just continue doing this falling wedge structure until the end of September. And the end of September is quite far away, friends. It's quite far away. So we could really be looking at a lot of further downside potential. And of course, a falling wedge is normally a bullish structure, and we have a bullish divergence in the RSI. But in these times, I think indicators don't mean so much anymore. I have the impression that you can throw most indicators away. Indicators are crazy oversold on historical levels, and it's just still dropping. The market is highly irrational right now. So I wouldn't be surprised if actually this wedge breaks to the downside and we really go brutally lower in an insane dump. And then in late September, when the Fed will pivot, then finally we are going up, but not before. Not before. I'm starting to think that we will not go up before. The market has become highly predictable somehow. It's hilarious how predictable it is. It's like everyone says we are going down, and yeah, indeed we are going down, it seems. So the market is highly funny in its predictability. And of course that means, friends, that Bitcoin is not looking so nice. That is pretty clear, especially if we go into the monthly chart. It is ugly. Friends, we have today the 30th of June. It's the last day of June. It's the last day of June. We will have the candle close, the monthly candle close today. And look at the ugliness of this candle. Instead of bouncing and closing higher, it is really closing very near to the lowest point. And such a monthly candle close is always extremely ugly and almost always followed by further downside. Here, you know, in 2018, it was followed by further downside. We had such a rounded bottom structure. Here in January 2015, it was followed by sideways and then further downside. Here in June 2013, it was followed by further downside. Here in 2011, it was followed by further downside. So there's not one single example in Bitcoin's entire history where we had a monthly candle close, an ugly monthly candle close, and then immediately went into pumping. There's not one single example in Bitcoin's entire history. Even here, you know, even here we got further downside. So it's no matter how you look at it, the fact that the monthly candle is now really closing at those levels is not a good sign. And personally, my worst case scenario target is the top of this June 2019 rally. So let me just zoom in. I think this is a very strong scenario where we have this double support line here, you know, which was resistance turned now to support. So we are looking at a drop which would also coincide very good to the previous corrections at an 82% bear market drop, which would kind of coincide quite nicely with the previous drop of 84%. So we would be looking at a very similar bear market correction, albeit of course much more relentless without any bounces in between, and also quite a lot faster. Because if we just look at the date range, that was 300, about a year until we reached the absolute low last time, right? And this time it is fascinatingly already happening after 231 days from the absolute top. But then, okay, you could say that, hey guys, this was actually the top, you know, this was actually the top. If you see it like this, then the correction is already taking longer. So it depends on how you define the top. What was the top even, you know? Was this the top or was this the top? Normally I would say this was the top, but price-wise, this was the top. So if you just take the worst case scenario and say 371 days from the time of this top here, then we are really looking at late November this year. We are looking at November this year to finally be over with the entire correction. And until then, a lot of stuff could happen. We could go here down to 12,500, maybe get a bounce and then revisit it a second time, kind of like the structure here in 2015 where we had this double test of the absolute low. And then we might recover somewhat, and only later then would we start going into the next cycle. So this is really not out of the question, unfortunately, especially if the Fed are complete psychopaths and they just continue hiking. And Powell just says, I don't care, I will just continue hiking to drive down inflation. It's a good idea to like wipe out billions of wealth and like make everybody poor so that nobody can buy anything anymore because the life savings of all people will just evaporate into thin air. Then of course nobody can buy anything anymore, and voila, the supply chain issues are magically resolved because people cannot buy stuff anymore. That's how you resolve supply chain issues, right? That's how you resolve inflation created by supply chain issues. What a wonderful playbook. So I'm starting to think that such a scenario is unfortunately not unlikely, and if we go into the logarithmic trend channel, this would mean that we would even dump below this long-term logarithmic trend channel. And as we can see, this has actually happened. We went below the trend line here, and also we went below the trend line here. So dumping even below that lowest possible trend line doesn't seem out of the question, and 12,500 would be below the trend line, but not by much. just as much as the previous times, and then we would quickly bounce in some form. So I'm starting to think, unfortunately, that such a scenario is not unrealistic. And since Bitcoin is rising a lot slower than we thought, this is not an unlikely scenario. And also there's a model from a guy on Twitter called DeFi. It's called the DPC model, a Bitcoin dynamic power cycle model. And this guy has actually made a model that is kind of looking realistic to me. I thought like this is a bit exaggerated, because he gives like a median price that Bitcoin would reach of about 14 to 15,000 by late 2023. But it looks as if this is not so unrealistic. Here is another zoomed in version of this chart. And we can see that this model of his actually predicted this whole cycle quite nicely, quite well. The red line is the model that he made in 2018. The dotted red line is the updated model. And we can see that in both models, we are going to prices below 20,000. And in the first model, we have actually, he says like kind of $12,000 by mid 2022. In the updated one, it's more like $15,000 by late 2022 or early 2023. But in either case, it looks really ugly. And in either case, new all-time highs only as late as 2024 and final all-time high only as late as October 2025. So I'm starting to think that such an ugly scenario, unfortunately, is not even so unlikely, friends. It's not even so unlikely anymore, looking at how the Fed is behaving, how relentlessly they are continuing to raise the interest rates. It's quite hilarious that their mandate to bring down inflation is like bringing down inflation by making everybody poor. It's quite hilarious, I have to say. Also a way to fulfill your mandate. It's also an interesting way to fulfill your mandate. I have to give them that. So that's my view for today, friends. I'm super mixed. I'm torn between the scenario that the Fed will pivot sooner than expected, then we can hope for a rebound, then we can hope for a rally that no one expects. But if the Fed pivots as late as, I don't know, later this year, September, November or whatever, then this thing will be really ugly and we are going down lower. We are most certainly going down lower. So friends, I wish I would have had better news, but what can I say? That is the reality of the market. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or interesting, please like and maybe even subscribe to this channel. I would be happy to welcome you here. I'm doing daily Bitcoin and crypto updates, comparing to the stock market and to other assets and with the Fed policy, so that we might be able to understand what is happening in the crypto market and where this insane market is headed. Don't despair, friends, because good times are coming either way. It's only a matter of time. Have a nice day and see you in the next video tomorrow. Bye.